We will continue in English and welcome our next international guest. It is Professor Simon Hallsworth from the University campus Suffolk in Great Britain. Simon is Professor of Sociology and Executive Dean for the Faculty of Arts, Business and Applied Social Science at the University campus Suffolk. He is a well-known expert in the study of urban violence and in this capacity has written extensively on the subject of street robbery, urban street gangs and weapon use. You have got a very interesting headline, When the Rules Went Down, Rethinking Riots as Performative Acts. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, let's go back. It's August 2011. We're in London. And the Metropolitan Police have managed to shoot dead yet another black male, Mark Duggan, in dubious circumstances. Not for the first time, and unfortunately probably not for the last time. Crowds gather, along with his family, outside the police station in Tottenham, where he lived. They're searching for information. Not much comes back. It's a classic example on how not to respond to an escalation. Tensions rise, violence breaks out. It sets us, as it were, a trigger for a massive escalation of violence that reaches out right across London. It takes hold in places where riots have occurred before, like Brixton, Hackney. But it starts to take hold in places that never rioted before, like Croydon. In Ealing, a relatively affluent suburb of London, the place is literally wrecked. In Croydon, buildings are set on fire. It reaches out beyond London, take hold in metropolitan cities right across England, but not interesting enough in Scotland or Wales. Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Salford. In Nottingham, 2 police stations are attacked. One is almost totally burnt down. It's estimated over 14,000 people were involved in these riots. It's the worst single outbreak of urban disorder that Britain has witnessed in the post-war period. Okay? So, how do you make sense of this? How has it been made sense of? And one way of looking at it is to say that the meaning of a riot is imminent to its performance. And I'll come back and explain what I mean by that later. But the meaning of riot is also retrospectively articulated in the narratives produced by those with an interest in explaining them, such as politicians or journalists or indeed academics. So what I want to do to begin with is I want to look at some of these dominant interpretations of the English riots, and I'm going to make some criticisms directed against them before I introduce a rather alternative way of making sense of riots, which I will read as performative acts. Change. Now, I'd say that there are 3 dominant interpretations that have occurred in the wake of those riots. The first one, which was articulated immediately, everyone already knew the answer as the riots were occurring, and that was the approach taken by the government and their friends in the right-wing media, and by some large most other people. The riots in the first instance were blamed by Prime Minister David Cameron on hierarchical street gangs. They'd apparently ceased fighting one another and had planned the worst outbreak of urban disorder the country has seen in decades. That kind of led seamlessly into this idea that it was all to do with mindless criminality, which is quite convenient, really, because if it's mindless criminality, you don't actually have to explain anything, because it's all mindless. And in the aftermath of the riots, the government, still looking for an explanation when it became clear that gangs weren't involved in orchestrating the riots, settled on troubled families, a susceptibility to gangster culture. And even schools were blamed for not, quote, installing character in children, i.e. telling them that they should be passive recipients or whatever the system dishes out. Now, probably 2 more influential and more carefully thought through interpretations I classify as both a liberal approach, which I'm going to explore through looking at the work of Tim Newburn at the London School of Economics, who together with The Guardian developed an approach called, well, their research was called Reading the Riots. And I'm also going to look at the approach adopted by a more critical left, as exemplified in the work of Zizek, Zygmunt Bauman, and also criminologists like Treadwell, Steve Hall, Simon Winlow. Now, to begin with, if you look at the Tim Newburn argument, it's quite an interesting one. He says, as the riots were occurring, he said he got together with the Guardian. They said, what you need to do is we need to read the riots, as if the riots are some kind of book. What does that mean in practice? Well, after the riots, they assembled a group of researchers and then diligently went about the task of collating large-scale empirical information on the riots. They spoke to rioters, to police officers and other stakeholders, notably, as I say, after the riots had occurred, in order to find out about the motivations that led people to riot. And they also coupled this with analysis of various data, like who had been arrested, what is the ethnicity of the people involved, their relationships with the police, their criminal records, their employment status, and so on. So what did this research tell us? Not too much we didn't know already. Riots are by and large perpetrated, not exclusively, by among the poorest section of our community. Predominantly, but not exclusively male. Equally weighted in terms of ethnicity, so these were not ethnic riots. Many of the riots were perpetrated simply by white population. It tells us that disadvantage seems to be a recurring structural feature. When you start looking at more clear motives for rioting, they said, well, there were many. Some people apparently went there to go on a shopping spree. Some people rioted because they wanted to make a political statement against the acts of bankers and politicians. And some people wanted to have fun. When pushed, Newburn's argument was that the riots expressed the marginalised existence into which Britain confined its urban poor, and poor police-community relations were emphasised as the proximate causes for the riots. Now, the third alternative, or third approach I want to look at here, is adopted by a far more critical left. And again, this is quite an interesting position, not least because it reverses the approach the left had traditionally taken towards riots. Eric Hobsbawm, the Marxist historian, many, many years ago described riots as the ballot box of the poor. That is, they are kind of a form of insurrection, a form of politics through which disadvantaged populations make a point. On this occasion, the critical left have totally abandoned this position by arguing that these riots were, in effect, not political events. They constituted what Zizek would go on to describe as meaningless outbursts on the part of a population of flawed consumers, to use Zygmunt Bauman's expression. Okay, so how does this explanation cash out? Well, we live in a society organised around the logic of compulsory consumption. To be is to consume. Not to be is to be unable to consume. Unfortunately, we also live in a society that consigns large swathes of its urban poor into precarious existence such that they cannot consume legitimately. Angry, alienated. When the police managed to shoot dead Mark Duggan, it ignited a kind of wave of riots, and this population had nowhere to go but the shops, in acts of flawed shopping. They dramatised their exclusion from the wider society. So these riots, in a sense, are not political, as were the riots in our immediate past, such as the Brixton riots, which are all about police brutality, racism. These were basically riots perpetrated by a constituency of the working class in freefall that basically had shopping on their minds, and when they had the opportunity to shop violently, they simply took the goods. Now, the government's response in the wake of these riots was to basically start tooling up the state. Not much by way of community policing. They gave exemplary sentences to the rioters, and the Mayor of London, in an act of pure stupidity, decided to employ water cannon just to stop them next time round. And exemplary sentences were given out to the rioters to squash any will to riot in the future. So that's where we stand now. But what about these other two explanations? So I'm not going to say any more about the government, but I want to start saying why I think the Newburn approach and why I think the approach of people like Bauman and Zizek are actually fundamentally wrong. Then I'm going to articulate my own position. As I said, for Tim Newburn, riots are things to be read as if they're some kind of book. Let me begin by comparing a riot with a demonstration. In a demonstration, you have a shared grievance, and everyone shares it. It is also shared with forces of law, with whom a route is agreed in advance so the demonstration can occur. The demonstration occurs. Leaders lead, more active protesters follow, followed by everyone else. At the conclusion of the event, the usual political exhortations are uttered and everyone then disperses and goes home. You have a head that controls a body that obeys, and everyone's unified by a common code. A riot is not a demonstration. Riots are improvised, assembled. They are emergent acts that occur in the moment. They are not scripted, okay? They are not scripts. There is no head that controls. There is no body that obeys. There is no common code, even if the collective is unified by a sense of indignation. A demonstration is like a book with chapters that passes, beginning, middle, and end. A riot is more like a rhizome, to use the expression of the French philosopher Deleuze. It's a bit like grass, things just set on fire. Translations occur through multiple networks. Things move in fast time. So riots are not books. And I also have a problem that you get to the meaning of a riot by talking to people after the riot has occurred. That presupposes they are rational subjects whose motivations are clear to themselves. As Freud observed many, many decades ago, us human beings are largely opaque to ourselves. Our motivations are not necessarily clear-cut. In a context of riots where crowd dynamics can intervene, people get drawn in for a wave of emotions that might not be necessarily clear to them. People often think with their senses more than clearly articulated thought. And in the aftermath of a riot, it's where riots have already been interpreted. It's easy to already draw upon these interpretations to make sense of why you were there. When you ask people to justify rule breaking, they can all quite often tidy up the act. So we've got to teach these post hoc rationalizations with a pinch of salt. Another problem I have with this approach is that typical when people go looking for the explanation of the riots, they immediately start going upstairs to look at the structural factors, the background factors. Is it about class? Is it about poor police relations? Is it about exploitation? Whatever. It's not that these might not be important, I'll come back to these later on, it's that they lose sight of the imminent foreground factors of a riot. The riot actually occurs in time and space. It's as if all that happens and you lay it to one side and then go, well, tell me about the riot. You're not looking at the riot itself. You've got to look at the foreground interactional dynamics of riots. You've got to look at what rioters do in the context of a riot if you're going to understand a riot. Which leads me to the conclusion that rioters are not texts. Just as riots don't have scripts, we should not see them as books that can be read. Rioters are a performative community. And this is a community that communicates precisely through their performance. Riots are thus performative acts that require an interpretive framework of analysis if we're to get to their meaning. Just as we would interpret a dance, you've got to look at the choreography of riot if you're going to make sense of it. So, let's start to think a little bit more carefully about what is it that the rioters were doing in the context of a riot. Because they were doing lots of interesting things simultaneously. First of all, you can notice that in riots, people attack the forces of law and order as opposed to respect and obey them, which you're normally supposed to do. That's a feature of everything that happened in these riots. The police were attacked. I walked down, it happened quite close to where I live in Lewisham in London. You walk down, and there they were. The police had quite literally kettled themselves in, surrounded by angry crowds of people throwing bricks at them. So attacking the forces of law and order, powerful trope in riots. In riots, these riots, rather than respecting property rights, they violated them. Property was attacked. Property was burnt down. In Croydon, they burnt down, large shops. In Ealing, I said, a relatively affluent area of London, the place was literally wrecked, smashed to pieces, not just looted. And of course, and this is the feature that's really been emphasized in these riots, people take commodities as opposed to pay for them. They loot shops, they engage in a bout of violent shopping. They don't just go into rich stores either. This has caused quite a lot of consternation on the part of the commentators that were watching these riots, saying that, look, they're going into pound shops. Why are they going into these cheap shops? Why aren't they looting from all the expensive ones? And that was read to say there's something sad about the rioters. I'll come back to that later as well. So they take commodities as opposed to pay for them. But what's also interesting about riots is people engage in strange intensities of pleasure and emotion. They do things that they would never do in their normal day-to-day lives. They wild out. They edge work. They put themselves in precarious situations that have potentially consequential payoffs for their future lives, like being arrested and prosecuted. They shout. They attack people. They swarm. They drift. They behave in ways that are not normally tolerated in subjects which are normally passive and docile. In other words, in riot, people behave in ways that seemingly reverse the fundamental principle of rule-governed societies, which is that within rule-governed societies, the normal tendency is to obey the rules. In riot, that principle is dramatically and spectacularly violated. The rules are torn down, and they're torn down by being inverted. In riot, the world is quite literally turned upside down. Which leads me to an interesting conclusion. Riots constitute a species of carnival. This is a picture of a medieval carnival. These carnivals existed all over Europe in the 14th century. By the time you get to the 18th century, they kind of declined. They still continue today in a rather more commodified form. Now, carnivals have been quite well theorized in the literature. For those that are interested in where I'm going to go next, you want to look at the work of the Russian theorist Bakhtin, who many years ago wrote a very, very, very famous book called Bakhtin and His World, in which he started to theorize the nature of carnivals. His basic argument runs something like this. It says, throughout most of their lives, peasants live in very hierarchical societies. The law comes down on them. They have to obey. They work hard. Have to obey God. They have to obey the rules. They have to worship the sacred. But one moment a year, Lent, the carnival time, they turn the world upside down. They engage in activities which are not normally licensed, promiscuous sexual activities. They engage in rituals which reverse the kind of norms of the mainstream society of which they're a part. We'll come back to the actual defining characteristics of carnival in a moment, but just look at the images of what's going on here. People swarming. You can see the guy here. Where have we got? Oh, look at this. Look at the guy sitting backwards on a horse. People in masks cavorting around. Look, fishing here with people wearing masks. People behaving in ways that, again, violate the norms of what normal society is supposed to be. These are sacrilegious occasions where people let their hair down. This is in a world which, again, is turned upside down. Now, this takes me to a different way of looking at riots as performances. Because riots, I say, are carnivals. The riot is a carnival. The English riots were a carnival of the precariat. So riots, I argue, constitute a carnival where the rules of rule-based societies are inverted. So let's study the performative aspects of riots as a carnivalesque occasion, okay? Now, Bakhtin argued there are 4 fundamental characteristic features of carnivals. There is the notion of familiar and free interaction between people. People who don't know each other come together and they party together in strange ways. In the English riots, you see the same thing. You see the territorial street gangs lay down their arms, come together in a festival of looting and violence. People who don't know each other congregate as a collective for a particular time and space. Then they disperse, possibly never to see each other again. As we've seen in riots, people behave in ways that violate the norms of what it is to be a normal, pacified, law-abiding subject. They run, they shout, they wild out. And again, this is a feature you find in all carnivals, eccentric behavior. Now, Carnival is also known for its misalliances, carnivalesque misalliances, as Bakhtin calls it. In Carnival, the world is turned, as I say, upside down. Lords wait on their servants. In 16th century France, parishioners bay at the priest like donkeys. In Rome, after Caesar has his festival, they have a carnivalesque festival where Caesar is played by a monkey. In Carnival, you see things like maypoles with all their phallic intonations celebrated. The fool becomes king for a day. The lord of misrule rules. And that starts to explain what you see in riot. Where all of a sudden, these strange acts that people engage in, stealing goods when you're supposed to pay for them, violating property rights in a capitalist society where property rights are sacrosanct. And in a society orchestrated around the logic of compulsory consumption, looting becomes another way in which the rules of the normal world are turned on the head. And the final feature of Carnival is the notion of sacrilegious behavior. Okay? Carnivals are profane events. They're there to offend people. You mock people. And that's what the rioters are doing. They're mocking our symbols. They're mocking the symbols of rule-based societies by violating those rules and turning them on the head, doing everything that they can to demonstrate that we're not part of you. Now, Bakhtin also makes another interesting point about Carnival. He says, in Carnival, the repressed comes to the service. From the periphery, it comes to assume center stage, at least for a moment. Carnivals don't last long. Normally, the normal world returns. Society is put back together again, and everything continues as normal. Okay, so in riots, I also would argue that people who are voiceless communicate, and the repressed assume central stage, at least for a moment. So a bit I take away from this is that riots are performances, and you've got to understand the performance itself if we're to understand the riots. And in these riots, as in many riots, the rules of the normal society are violated by being stood on the head. That is the symbolic violence of riots. That is also in part its political force, and I'll develop that argument in a minute. Now, let me take on the arguments of people like Zizek and Bauman, because I've got some problems with their attempt to write the riots off as if they're non-important or they're not political events at all, because that doesn't lead to very clever policy responses. We need to learn from riots. So what is the problem I have with the left here? First of all, if you look at the Conservative government in the wake of the riots, they spent a lot of time talking about mindless criminality. That's all it was about. For the left, they've picked up on the idea that these riots were essentially about shopping, violent shopping, flawed shopping. Shophocalypse now, I think is Steve Wall and Simon Winlow define it. Yet these riots were far more than about violent shopping. Violent shopping featured, looting featured in these riots, but much else happened as well. As I say, Ealing was wrecked. In Nottingham, police stations were burnt down. They were using selective evidence. They were bigging up one aspect of a riot at the expense of looking at everything else that was going on. Lesson I take from this is you've got to look at it all in a round to understand what a riot is about. And quite frankly, violent shopping or looting is a perennial feature of riots in most places. The riots in Brixton in 1981 happened outside of where I happened to be living, in a squat at the time. And there was a big bout of looting that happened then. Bob Marley wrote a song called A Burning and a Looting, obviously aware that in riots, people loot. Part of the problem I really have with these theories, though, is that rather than looking for an explanation of the riots, asking the question, why here, why now? They already had an explanation into which the riots were neatly fitted. So Zygmunt Bauman has long articulated a thesis that says that people have become consumers in a consumer-driven culture, and that those without are, as he calls them, flawed consumers. So when these riots occurred, he simply wrote his piece and said, yes, my thesis is proved. This is all about flawed consumption. But another problem I have with them It's much the same problem I have with the Newburn approach. That fails because it tries to treat riots as texts. It tries to reduce the world to a text that can be read rather than a performance that needs to be understood. And the problem here is these commentators work with the notion of the political, which is articulated at such a high level that it leaves them totally blind to forms of non-linguistic, cultural resistance, which does not conform to the political narrative they're working with. They want a politics of a manifesto. They want a clearly articulated grievance, and they can't find any amongst these rioters. They want a clear statement of a better alternative, and they're not seeing it, which leads them to misrepresent the riots and write it off as if it's just simply acts of shopping gone wrong. And that leads them in turn to denigrate a class which ostensibly they should be supporting. So this is my way of thinking about the politics of riot, because riots, my argument is, are always asking us questions we need to answer. We should always see riots as complex events that pose questions we've got to think long and hard about. Riots, let me give it an obvious proposition. Riots always tell us there's something badly wrong with the social system. Riots don't happen often. When they do happen, it tells us something has gone badly wrong somewhere. First point. Secondly, in riots, a group dramatizes its relationship to the conditions of existence, where clearly that relationship is experienced as antagonistic in some very crucial respect. Or to use the words of the previous presentation, hostile relations are at the center of all this. Now, riots don't necessarily express a legitimation crisis, though they can, if you think of the riots that went up in the wake of the Egyptian Spring. There was about a legitimation crisis. The groups on the streets were dramatizing their total rejection of a regime that had lost all authority. But riots always, I would argue, express a crisis of legitimacy in the ruling regime. Okay? Because in riots, people are contesting someone's right to rule. When people collectively violate and profane the rules of law-abiding societies, they're making a point about their relationship to the ruling regime. That doesn't mean to say that in the first outbreak of a riot, people are maybe spontaneously confronting a provocation, the temerity of the police to shoot black people, the flashpoint, the trigger point. And of course, as they kick off, then it gives them a chance to act out emotions they may strongly feel, but not necessarily be consciously aware of. Now, this is my point as well. Rioters do not necessarily know the causes that lead them to feel the way they do. That then gets expressed in the context of group psychology in the form of a riot. They do not know a priori what causes them to drift onto the streets to pick up stones and throw them. In fact, if they did know the causes a priori, they would probably articulate their feelings through something like a demonstration. Riots operate at a much more pre-conscious level. Now, crowds have one power resource inherent in them. It's what Matt Clement perceptively calls crowd power, the imminent, violent force imminent within a collective. And when they mobilize that power to desecrate the symbols of rule-based societies, that tells us they're making a powerful political statement. Especially given that riot, as I say, is an unplanned, unscripted, situationally determined emergent act. But never write it off as unpolitical. Riots are always political. When you profane the symbols of rule-based society, you are making a strong point, and points towards us to say, why are they making that point? In riots, in these acts of collective profanation of the rules and symbols of rule-based societies, rioters demonstrate the lie of the establishment that holds that the social glue is strong, that we are integrated, that all of us are one, Queen and country, we're all in it together. We're all English, we're all British. Rioters are dramatizing in their performance that we, the rioters, are not part of you. Look how different we are. Look what we do with your rules. And this is also in part the politics of riots. And this was perceptively noted as well by the right-wing media pundit Max Hastings, who in the aftermath of the riots wrote scathingly of the rioters. They're not proud of English. They're not proud to be English. They don't, what did he say? He says, they don't like royal weddings. They don't watch test matches. Precisely. That's the point of riots, to say, no, we are not part of you. We're not part of your rituals. We're not part of your imagined community. So let me just return now to this idea of violent shopping. It's not the shopping aspect itself that is the political force of the riot. It's the violence, the symbolic violence that underpins it. You know, Bauman is right. In our contemporary society, for young people particularly, shopping malls have become our contemporary temples. They don't go to church, but they go to the shopping malls 7 days a week. So when people take without paying, they're making a powerful political statement, violently. This leads me then to two final conclusions. Methodologically, how do we approach riots? As spectators, maybe as policymakers, as concerned human beings. First of all, we need to ask ourselves, because the riots are telling us in their performance what they think of us, but we need to think, why are they behaving that way? What has happened to them to make them perform this way to us? Now, again, if you want to look at some of those wider structural factors here, these riots in 2011 occurred against the backdrop of austerity, or the backdrop of the worst financial crisis in post-war history, created not by kids on inner-city estates, by among the most intelligent, wealthy individuals on this planet, who escaped scot-free from the consequences of their decisions. But the consequences of that recession were felt nakedly by the class from which the rioters came, the precariat, who faced, quite clear, welfare cuts, wage repression, and deteriorating labour conditions in our free market society. So timing is quite crucial here. In a world where the ruling regime has itself hollowed out its own right to rule, it's worth bearing in mind here that the riots occurred. We had a crisis in the economic system, which bequeathed us austerity and recession and mass unemployment and massive cuts to the welfare state. But we also had a massive political crisis in England, where our political elite were exposed quite literally with its hands in its pockets in a political expenses scandal. So you have a crisis in the economic system, you have a crisis in the political system, and suddenly you get this crisis in the social system, manifesting itself in the form of an urban riot. And politically, my final slide. How do we respond to riot? What's an appropriate way? As we saw, the response of the Conservative government was simply to ramp up Leviathan, tool up the state, hand out exemplary sentences to the rioters, and basically try and scare the living daylights out of them so they wouldn't riot again. They didn't do anything to counter the deeper causes. But I go back to this point. If riots betray a legitimation deficit, surely this must invite us to examine what we've done, sanctions to make the outside feel the way it does. Because riots always pose questions to which we, the audience, are invited to find an answer. And my final point is this. If riots intimate a violent tear in the body politic, because that's it, it's expressive surely of a wound in the society. When people collectively desecrate symbols, when they attack the forces of law and order, when they reverse the norms of rule-based societies, that's telling us there's a massive naked wound in the body politic. I don't know what you do when you confront wounds, but I think the destiny would be to try and heal those wounds. That has not happened in English society, but I hope it happens in Sweden. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I do believe we have like 4 minutes for questions. Are there any questions here in the audience? Please raise your hand and we will have a microphone coming to you. I would like to take the opportunity myself then to ask you, should we interpret riots as a failure of a political system or social system? Is that a conclusion?
They represent a failure at many levels. I mean, these riots represent a failure economically, because if you look at the class from which these rioters came, and you look at conditions, or what Richard Sennett calls the hidden injuries of class, they've experienced significant injury. they have a right to be angry. It's a failure politically because the class from which this class of rioters came from, they've been ignored by the government, they're stigmatized. Poverty is assumed the status of a self-awful disease in English society. It's not something that's unfortunate that's done to people. It's something they're supposed to create themselves. So yeah, it's political failure as well. And then right down to the operational tactics, you know, it's by not lost on many people that many of the areas where these riots occurred, tensions between the police and urban youth were, to put it mildly, hostile.
So what is the recipe then? Is that to increase our own tolerance with riots and start working with the society and political system, or?
I think the previous speaker should be invited to do some of his presentations in England, quite frankly, because a bit more conflict resolution, a community problem-solving approach, I think is specifically what we require there. And it's just a follow-up from the final slide, which is you must always learn. And you should also follow up by one should not forget either. And in England, they have a tendency to learn and then forget, and then start repeating history as farce.
Sure. Is there any final question here from the audience? Okay,
I was just going to make one point. If anyone wants to have a conversation with me, I'll be having a coffee outside after this. So if you want to pick me up there for anything, then please feel free to do so. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you so much for coming here. Simon, there is a gift.